I wanted text. You softly tonight, but fingers froze. Words became heavy in throat, heart beating fast. I stared, screen glowing like tiny moonlight, calm, thoughts scattered like autumn leaves falling quietly down. I wanted to ask how your day had been today, but how are felt too small for what I feel. So I typed letters, not words, but emotions pure. I wrote slowly, line after line, like gentle river, each word whispered, your name quietly, without ever saying. I ended writing instead of texting because poems hold more than words. They carry heart in silent rhythm. I wrote first how your smile stays in mind, how morning thoughts always find you without hesitation yet, how coffee tastes less sweet now without your laugh, how sunsets sigh for missing presence. In my quiet, I wrote then how every heartbeat seems your echo, how every song sings your laughter inside my chest, how rain reminds me of touch, soft, invisible, tender. I paused again, stared, blank screen, heart swelling heavy. I typed slowly. I think constantly of your eyes, then deleted line because it's small for what burns. I wrote again. I see everywhere your face, your calm, then erased softly because my soul wanted poetry deeper. I wrote endlessly about your hands and how gentle they seemed even in memory only, like sacred glow. I wrote about your laugh quietly, shaking my soul. I wrote about your voice softly, in silent whispers. I wrote how even absence feels presence when dreaming. I wrote now because I cannot stop thinking you. My fingers danced like tiny birds over glowing screen, but no text. Escaped tonight, only lines filled. I wrote confessions. I never dared speak aloud ever. I wrote stories of my heart and your shadow. I wrote about how coffee waits for your laughter. I wrote poems like gentle prayers into night silence. I wrote slowly because time bends around your memory. I wrote because words alone cannot hold the weight of quiet devotion and endless hope. I wrote then, I miss you, and deleted quickly because missing you is obvious already. To my chest, I wrote again, I love deeply, but erased carefully because love, pure, doesn't need proof, only living proof. I wrote how every star reminds me of you, how every moon glows your face. Inside my dreams, I wrote about the way wind might carry whispers. I wrote about how silence echoes your laughter still. I wrote about how coffee tastes like missing warmth. I wrote endlessly because texting cannot hold forever. My heart is too large for two lines. I wrote gently lines of poetry to reach you without sending, without showing, just breathing softly. I wrote slowly, each line broken, like gentle sighs. I wrote truths I never dared say aloud yet. I wrote you more than words. I wrote you, I wrote until fingers tired, heart still awake. I wrote about how mornings ache without your presence. I wrote about how nights whisper your name softly. I wrote about how every glance is stored memory. I wrote about how I wonder if you feel the same ways I do silently every single day. I wrote because poems are home for hidden hearts. I wrote because texts cannot carry truth like poems. I wrote until tears came, warm and quiet. I wrote until moon glowed, bright and soft. I wrote until stars nodded and whispered calm. I wrote because you live inside my thoughts. I wrote because I breathe your memory endlessly. I wrote because my heart refuses silence now. I wrote about your eyes like morning skies. I wrote about your smile like summer light. I wrote about your soul like sacred song. I wrote about how love cannot be hidden. I wrote about how words cannot describe fully. I wrote because I cannot send simple text. I wrote because love spills like river endless. I wrote until my soul felt quiet, calm. I wrote poems like letters to your soul. I wrote prayers inside verses for your happiness. I wrote hopes inside rhymes for your safety. I wrote gently because touching your soul is sacred. I wrote about how tomorrow might bring you closer softly. Inside my life, without rushing time, I wrote because poems live longer than messages. I wrote endlessly because missing you is infinite. I wrote because texting feels small against ocean. I wrote because my love cannot be contained. I wrote about your face like moonlight calm. I wrote about your voice like whisper soft. I wrote about your hands like gentle wind. I wrote until my chest could hold no more. I wrote until my heart felt full finally. I wrote poems instead of texts because love deserves poetry, devotion, silence, honesty, courage, patience, waiting, breathing, dreaming. I wrote to you softly without sending because one day you'll read my confessions entirely, because one day you'll feel my heart openly, because one day you'll know I wrote for you, and every poem will be our secret language. I wrote until sleep came and moon watched. I wrote until stars whispered and night listened. I wrote until dawn broke and I smiled because poetry holds what text cannot, and love lives inside every line, inside every pause, inside every sigh. I wrote, Dear, because I love you without limit. I wrote tonight, and tomorrow I'll write again, because one poem cannot contain my heart fully. I wrote for you, only you, always. I wrote poems instead of texts, because my love cannot be short, cannot be simple, cannot be hidden. I wrote poems because poetry knows how hearts feel. I wrote poems because you live inside every word. I wrote poems because I cannot text everything. I wrote poems, and I hope one day you read all and understand my silent love. I woke early, still thinking of your smile. Coffee smells, but it's missing warmth. I opened phone, wanted type your name, fingers froze, heartbeats raced, thoughts scattered everywhere. So I wrote instead a poem like soft prayer, lines forming like rivers inside my chest. I wrote about your eyes, how they shine, how they speak without words, how they stay. I wrote about your laughter and gentle voice. I wrote about your hands that calm storms. I wrote about how mornings aren't mornings without your presence, without your silent whispers. I wrote because texts feel small, inadequate. Poems hold everything hidden inside my chest. I wrote until heart felt full of you. I wrote until words became small rivers flowing. I wrote about your face like morning sun. I wrote about your soul like sacred temple. I wrote about how I can't stop thinking. You live inside my every heartbeat. You live inside every silent pause. I wrote slowly because love cannot be rushed. I wrote gently because poems carry heart's truth. I wrote letters to your invisible ears. I wrote confessions you don't yet know. I wrote dreams of holding your hand. I wrote wishes for morning with your laughter. I wrote fears of losing you somehow. I wrote hopes that one day you'd see how deeply you are inside my chest. I wrote tears that never fell outside. I wrote silently because night keeps secrets safe. I wrote endlessly because words cannot contain all the feelings your presence ignites in me. I wrote carefully because every syllable matters. I wrote long because hearts can't be brief. I wrote gently because love deserves patience. I wrote secretly because texting feels too small. I wrote honestly because poems hold more truth. I wrote slowly Because I feel your soul, I wrote prayers inside verses. For your safety, I wrote wishes inside rhymes. For your joy, I wrote quietly. Because silence can still speak, I wrote tenderly. Because longing is gentle sometimes, I wrote softly. Because night watches silently, I wrote for you only, you always. I wrote confessions hidden in between my words. I wrote dreams of mornings together laughing. I wrote hopes of evenings walking quietly. I wrote poems instead of short texts. I wrote lines because my heart cannot rest. I wrote until my chest was calm. I wrote until fingers tired but heart awake. I wrote letters that never sent anywhere. I wrote truths I cannot say aloud. I wrote prayers for courage to one day finally speak all to your ears. I wrote poems because love cannot be small. I wrote because texts cannot hold infinity. I wrote because I cannot stop thinking. I wrote because you exist inside everything. I wrote about your smile like gentle dawn. I wrote about your voice like sacred hymn. I wrote about your soul like quiet temple. I wrote because I love you endlessly. I wrote until moon faded and stars disappeared. I wrote until dawn came and coffee cooled. I wrote poems instead of texts because poems breathe, they carry heart, they carry soul, they carry devotion. I wrote poems to capture what I feel. I wrote poems because you deserve everything. I wrote poems because I cannot stay silent. I wrote poems because missing you is infinite. I wrote poems and my heart feels lighter. I wrote poems and I finally smiled. I wrote poems instead of sending a text because poems contain love more than words. I wrote poems and now I'll write more. Tomorrow, next day, always, forever, for you alone. The night stays silent, but my heart races. I wanted text you softly, but fingers shook. So I wrote again and again, endlessly. I wrote about your eyes like moonlight calm. I wrote about your smile like morning sun. I wrote about how your voice fills empty rooms. I wrote about your hands holding invisible warmth. I wrote about how thoughts always find you. I wrote about the way you linger everywhere. I wrote about your laughter like soft bells. I wrote about your presence inside every breath. I wrote because texts feel small, insignificant, short. Poems hold everything heart cannot express otherwise. I wrote until tears fell onto glowing screen. I wrote until fingers hurt and heart soared. I wrote confessions never spoken, never shared before. I wrote dreams of walking beside you silently. I wrote wishes of mornings with your laughter. I wrote prayers for courage to finally tell. I wrote silently because night keeps secrets safe. I wrote carefully because love cannot be rushed. I wrote endlessly because heart cannot rest quietly. I wrote poetry because texts cannot hold infinity. I wrote thoughts of your smile at sunrise. I wrote memories of imagined moments we haven't shared. I wrote about how every song reminds me of your voice, your laughter, your invisible warmth. I wrote about how stars reflect your glow. I wrote about how wind whispers your name. I wrote about how mornings feel incomplete without you beside me, silently holding nothing visible. I wrote because I cannot text everything. I wrote because you exist inside every heartbeat. I wrote slowly because love deserves patience always. I wrote softly because longing is gentle sometimes. I wrote tenderly because poetry carries devotion silently. I wrote carefully because my heart cannot rest. I wrote endlessly because missing you is infinite. I wrote confessions hidden in lines and pauses. I wrote poems to show you my soul. I wrote poems instead of sending simple texts. I wrote because love deserves more than brevity. I wrote because I wanted you to feel. I wrote because my heart is yours. I wrote until moon faded, stars disappeared. I wrote until dawn came and coffee cooled. I wrote lines like gentle rivers flowing endlessly. I wrote because every heartbeat belongs to you. I wrote because poetry carries what words cannot. I wrote about how I see you everywhere. I wrote about how I feel your presence. I wrote about how I cannot breathe normally. I wrote about how I cannot eat peacefully. I wrote because you linger inside every thought. I wrote because you live inside my dreams. I wrote because I cannot stay silent anymore. I wrote because my heart has no boundaries. I wrote because love grows stronger than fear. I wrote because missing you hurts more than words.